It's time to get gouache-y. Y'all know I absolutely love to explore in my creative practice, exploring different subjects, different styles, different mediums, but I always keep coming back to gouache. It's so versatile and it has a look that simply can't be replicated with any other medium. Now, I've been using gouache for a little over 4 years now, I think, and I am by no means an expert. But I have learned a few things, so today I will be imparting those things unto you. Now, if you're a true beginner to gouache, I would recommend that you watch this video first. It's an older one, the editing's a little rough, and I'm a little bit obnoxious. I do think I've toned it down a little bit since then, so hopefully today's video will be a little bit more pleasant to watch. But that video does have a lot of really helpful info if you're just getting started with gouache. But for the non-newbies, the intermediates, the ones looking to take their gouache journey to the next level, this one's for you. So grab your supplies and let's get gouache-y. So we're going to be going through these tips kind of in order of how you would use them throughout your gouache process. Tip number 1, keeping it activated. Now, activated means that it's currently wet and workable. You can swipe your brush across it and it's gonna move around. If you've watched literally any of my gouache videos, you've probably heard me rant and rave about just how much I love working wet and wet with gouache. As the name implies, you're working wet paint into wet paint. Now, gouache has a superpower. It's a fast-drying medium, which is great for things like plein air painting or quick color comps, thumbnail sketches, but when you like working wet on wet like I do, that superpower can be a super nightmare. You slap on a bit of color, mix a new one, and by the time you're ready to work the new color in, your paint is mostly dry and wet becomes a big, patchy mess. We've all been there, and it's incredibly frustrating. But there are ways to work around this and keep your gouache activated while it's on the page. Because the truth is, this isn't really a paint problem, it's a paper problem. So when you're laying down paint on completely dry paper, the paint will immediately start to dry because there's no moisture in the paper to keep it activated. So I used to use like a big flat brush and just wet my whole paper before I'd start a new painting so I could start off wet and wet. This was somewhat effective. It would give me a little bit of wiggle room for drying time, but there's an even better way. So this is a tip I learned from Justin Donaldson's gouache class, which I highly recommend. It is worth every single penny. So if you really want to keep your paint activated for a good portion of time, there are 2 simple steps. Number 1, grab a baking sheet, fill it with water, and pre-soak your paper. Now this is where it's crucial that you're using a higher quality paper. Most mixed media papers or cheaper watercolor papers are not going to be able to hold up to this. So I like using Arches cold press paper. I know, it's a bit pricey, but I truly do believe it's worth it. It gives me a much better painting experience. So how long you soak it for could depend on what your climate is. My house is fairly cool and very dry, so I have to soak mine for a little bit longer, around 12-ish minutes. Now, if you live in a more humid area, 7 or 8 minutes might be the perfect amount for you. One thing to note here is that soaking your paper does start to break down the sizing of the paper. So sizing affects the absorbency of the paper. Paper without sizing will just soak up all the paint straight into the fibers. Paper with sizing will keep your paint more on the surface. This is why I never soak my paper past about that 12-minute mark, because I do want some of the sizing to remain intact. Now, I still don't fully understand sizing and all of the nitty-gritty facts about it. I'm sure somebody far smarter than I can explain it. So if you want to learn more about sizing, Google is your friend. So this step alone is going to do wonders for keeping your gouache activated. But if you want to 10x that drying time, don't skip step number 2. Soak a few paper towels or a potato sack towel and lay it down underneath your now soaked paper. So simply using the soaked paper will probably give you a good 1.5 to 2 hours before it really starts to dry. But incorporating the soaked towels is going to at least double that. Your paint soaks in the moisture from the paper, but your paper now has this whole storehouse of moisture to pull from those towels. So keeping your gouache activated is crucial for working wet and wet, or for achieving those very smooth, subtle blends. For example, let's say you want to do a master study of a John Singer Sargent painting. You love the incredibly subtle transitions he uses to render out a face, but you can't seem to mimic that in gouache because your gouache keeps drying too quickly. So by using this method to keep your gouache activated, it's much easier to replicate the subtleties of oil paints, which is what Sargent was using, because you're giving yourself the time you need to create those smooth blends. So the next time you want to keep your gouache activated, give this trick a try. Just popping in to share that I have lots of autumn art prints and stickers available right now in my shop. If you're a fan of all things autumnal and cozy, this sticker sheet bundle is definitely for you. We've got soups, we've got squash, we've got grilled cheese. Or if you're more of a curious creative, you can also pick up a course or a workbook. As always, every order is Annie Jane approved. And now, back to the gouache tips. Tip number 2, using the full range of consistencies. So like we talked about earlier, gouache is very, very versatile. You can thin it out with a lot of water and use it basically like watercolors. Very thin, very flowy, very transparent, and you can use it straight from the tube or container, similar to acrylics. It's going to be at its most pure and opaque state straight from the tube. Now I do want to add a little bit of a tangent here. You may have noticed that I'm using Nik or poster colors for this illustration. So I've gotten a lot of comments in the past about how gouache and poster colors are not the same thing, and in some cases, that is true. Poster color is a very general term and can be a lot closer to watercolor than it is to gouache. However, Nik or poster colors use the same binder as regular gouache does, and it's opaque and able to be reactivated just like gouache. Now I think they use slightly different pigment sizes for the colors, but in terms of usability, it's the same thing. I use them interchangeably all the time, and I don't notice any kind of difference in the painting process or in the painting itself. Tangent over, back to consistencies. So gouache is a pendulum that can swing either direction, super thin and transparent, as well as super thick and opaque, and anywhere in between. But I don't think this is something that many artists truly take advantage of. I am one of the ones who doesn't. Part of this is that I love that thick, rich quality of opaque paint, but I think the bigger part of this is that I'm most comfortable working thickly with gouache. Now, do I think there's anything wrong painting the way you're most comfortable? No, but I also think many paintings could be more than what they are if we were courageous enough to step out of our comfort zones and try some new things. Most often I see people only using it thinly or only using it thickly. And again, there isn't anything wrong with that, especially if you're just starting out and you're trying to get to know gouache one consistency at a time. But to achieve a more dynamic and expressive painting, exploring multiple consistencies is where it's at. So think of artists like Kazuo Oga, who worked on a lot of the Studio Ghibli movies like Princess Mononoke, My Neighbor Totoro, and Spirited Away. Every single one of his paintings contains a full range of consistencies, and each of these different consistencies has a different expression. So Justin Donaldson refers to these different consistencies as alive and dead. There's this alive state where the paint is a bit thinner, able to move around more wildly, and creates lots of unique effects. We get these interesting, unexpected textures and a lot more blooming. Then there's the dead state where the paint is at its thickest and most opaque. There is a presence to the dead state. It's solid, it's steady, it says,
"Hey, I'm here and I'm staying."
Both states are wildly, wonderfully different and great for achieving different outcomes, but I'd been working mostly in the dead state. It's where I was most comfortable. That alive state is a bit more uncontrollable, and we all know I'm a bit of a control freak. But when we look at some of Kazuo Oga's paintings, there's more life and movement and structure overall because he uses gouache's full range of consistencies. We see these areas of alive paint where one color is flowing into another and it's a little bit thinner and more textured. And then he adds these areas of thicker paint, like specific blades of grass or a lamp or a window frame, and it gives it structure. It tells you,
"This is what you're looking at here."
So in this bed and breakfast painting, I decided going into it that I was going to step out of my comfort zone and really explore more of what gouache has to offer. More specifically, I was going to attempt to use the alive stage with most of the floor and with the wall in the foreground. And this was terrifying, let me tell you. That alive stage starts off looking so wonky and so messy. Multiple times I found myself going,
how is this ever going to turn out well? It looks like hot garbage right now.
and I'm not gonna lie, there were several moments where I thought,
You know, I could just layer over this with thicker gouache. I know I can make that turn out right.
but every time I reminded myself that the point was to try something new and to see if I could make it work the way that it was. So I had to lay down that thinner, messier gouache in its alive state and just let it be what it was. But as I began to work a little bit thicker and thicker in other areas around it, it really did start to come together. I think especially with the foreground wall. Once upon a time, I would have painted that wall flat and dead, but that alive, messier paint makes it so much more exciting to look at. It makes it look a little bit more weathered in some areas, or like a bit of light is bouncing off of a surface and changing a bit of the color. And same with the flooring. The alive paint gave the floor its own unique color and value shifts and textures without me having to make those decisions and paint them in one at a time. The alive state brought movement to this piece, and the dead state brought the structure and tangibility, if that makes sense. Tip number 3, glazing. A pretty good rule of thumb for beginner gouaches is to use gouache thin to thick or fat over lean. Because gouache reactivates, slapping another layer of gouache down over another, particularly if that new layer is especially watery, can be very, very risky. All of a sudden, that bottom layer reactivates and starts breakdancing all over the page. So for a beginner artist, staying away from glazing is a fairly good idea. However, glazing, or using a thin layer over a thicker one, is absolutely possible, but it does take some practice. So there are several ways to go about this depending on what you're trying to paint. 2 of the spots I used glazing in this painting were the syrup on the pancakes and the cast shadows on the floor. So let's start with the shadows. For the shadow around Fergus the Fox in the foreground,
Wow, try saying that 5 times fast.
Anywho, so I didn't start with the paper wet. Yes, the paper towel underneath was wet, so I guess the paper was slightly damp, but I didn't add any additional water to it. I mixed up this thin, dark shadow color and lightly glazed it where it needed to go, then moved outward, progressively glazing lighter and lighter shadows. Once I'd created the right shape and extended it out, I took a clean, wet brush and swiped it over the edges. Now, 2 important points here. My brush was only slightly wet. I'd wiped off a significant amount of the clean water from it before I ever touched the bristles to the paper. Using too much water can reactivate the underneath layer and create a ring around the edge, and it's not cute. Secondly, I used a very light brush pressure. Again, too much pressure will begin to lift the paint underneath. All I wanted to do was glaze a new color on top, not move what was already there. So for the shadows underneath the table, I first took a clean wet brush and swiped it around where the shadows would be, slightly extending it a little bit farther than the shadows themselves would extend. Then I started in with my shadow color using a very light brush pressure. I then went in on a few areas with a darker shadow color where necessary. To finish, I used a clean, slightly wet brush again to soften the edges of the overall shadow shape and called it good. Now for the glaze on the syrup of the pancakes, I needed to work quickly and confidently. No scrubbing with the brush. Simply mixing my glaze color and confidently slipping it across the pancakes. So syrup is transparent, so we really want to see the detail of the pancake underneath. Glazing is amazing. Ugh, that's a dumb rhyme. I should turn that into a sticker. Anyways, so glazing is amazing for when you want to preserve the detail of the layers underneath, but you need to change the value or the hue or the saturation. Now, I definitely recommend practicing glazing on like a swatch of colors in a sketchbook before trying it out on a super fancy painting. The learning process can be frustrating and full of failures, which is great because that's how you learn, but it's not for the faint of heart. I also did use some glazing for some leafy viney dudes hanging down from the roof, but I forgot to film that, so you'll see it in the final reveal. Anywho, let's chat a little bit about the illustration itself before we say our goodbyes. So I'm not gonna lie, this one was a bit of a fight in the planning process. I did 1,000,001 thumbnail sketches and could not figure out for the life of me how to set up the composition. So the problem was that I was trying to do like a vertical zoomed in shot of B serving the pancakes, but I was running into issues with how the guests would be seated at the table to where we could still see what was going on. But like we talked about in the creative frustration video, sometimes you just need to take a breath, take a break, and take a walk. On said walk, I realized,
Oh, If I just make it a horizontal illustration, that's going to give me a lot more room to extend the table. And if I zoom out, we can see everything a lot better. I could also explore creating depth in the scene by adding a character to the foreground, which would be a really fun challenge.
So after that brainstorming debacle, basically everything was smooth sailing afterwards. I'm not even joking, I think this is the most peaceful painting experience I've had literally ever. I decided to do a couple of color comps before jumping in, but I absolutely fell in love with the first comp, so I didn't even need the second one. I did tweak a couple of colors in the final painting, but they were mostly minor elements. I just put on a gouache-y playlist and painted and painted and painted for days, and it was glorious. Now, I was nervous about painting the sunflowers because those little floral throwing stars are deceptively difficult, but surprisingly, it went just fine. I was also nervous about the glazing, which also ended up going fine. I did struggle a little bit with B. I confused myself a bit on where the shadows needed to be and how light affects black fur, but I do think we got there in the end, and I was really happy with it. The one thing that does kind of bug me is the angle of Fergus's head. It's just a bit off, like the tilt isn't tilting quite how it should, but it wasn't something that I felt like I really needed to repaint and fix, so we're just gonna move on. Okay, so I think this might be my favorite Meriki Meadow painting, and I think there's a few reasons why that could be. Actually, it's probably just all of them combined, but anyways. Number one, the color palette. Y'all know, I'm obsessed with yellow. It is the happiest color, and you can't look at it without feeling that little sparkle of happiness. It's just a fact, I don't make the rules. I also really love complementary colors, and this one is kind of a split complementary palette. We have all these golden tones, and then this like soft grayish blue, and this big, bold raspberry purple. Ugh, it makes me happy. It's a bit different than what I typically reach for, but I'm really excited with how it turned out. Number two, this was the first meadow painting I did after my little journey of healing my relationship with creativity, and I was so excited to be happy about art again. There was a new, fresh joy that went into this piece, and I think that's somewhat visible in it. I was excited about the process again, I'd let go of limiting beliefs, I was equipped to face fears and frustrations, and I was confident that I was going to get through this piece no matter what. Number three, I tried some new things with it. I really explored with this one, and I think that 10x'd the fun of this piece. Like I said earlier, I played around with different paint consistencies, which was nerve-wracking, but very cool. I also played around with how I rendered the characters in the background. I toned down the rendering and let them almost dissolve, I guess, a little bit in the light from the windows. Now, I did this a bit with some of the characters in the Meriki Meadow Market illustration last year, but I think it was much more effective in this one. Overall, I'm just so happy with how this piece turned out, from the painting process to the painting itself. I'm excited to add this one to the Meriki Meadow collection. So I've made several prints of this, including a fancy boy 8x12 if you're an art print maximalist like I am. So if you like this piece, if you vibe with it, maybe consider picking up a print. Anywho, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching me paint this illustration, and I hope the tips today helped you level up your own gouache process. Huge thank you to the Cozy and Curious Creatives over on Patreon for helping to support my art journey. And don't forget, there's also a free tier on Patreon if you want to see some more snippets of my artwork. If you're interested in another Meriki Meadow painting, then head on over to watch this video next. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye guys!